The first time Colonel Drayden told her she didn't belong in the program, she didn't argue. She didn't flinch. She picked up her rifle, walked back to her lane, and put 3 rounds through the same hole at 400 yards. Nobody said anything after that. But Drayden remembered. Men like Drayden always remembered. Sergeant First Class Annika Teague had spent 11 years in the Army learning how to be invisible when it suited her and visible when it mattered. She had deployed twice to places whose names she wasn't allowed to say in public. She had qualified expert on every individual weapons system the Army offered, and 2 that weren't on the standard list. She had a scar on her left forearm from Kandahar that she told people was from a kitchen accident, and 3 people in the world knew that was a lie. She arrived at Fort Bragg in late October, which is the kind of month that can't decide what it wants to be. The trees were halfway between color and bare. The mornings were cold enough that her breath showed when she stepped outside, but the afternoons climbed back into the 60s as if they'd forgotten what season they were in. She'd been assigned to the newly established Precision Engagement Assessment course, a selection-style pipeline designed to identify candidates for a cross-branch special operations support role that had no official name yet and only a handful of billets. 12 candidates had been selected from across the force. She was the only woman. She knew this before she arrived. She had accepted it the way she accepted most things, as a condition, not a complaint. The cadre were waiting when the candidates assembled on the first morning. There were 3 of them, and the one in the middle was Drayden. Colonel Harlan Drayden was the kind of officer who had built an entire identity around a certain definition of excellence. And that definition was, in most respects, narrow. He had 32 years of service. He had a combat infantryman badge and a chest full of ribbons and a jaw that looked like it had been assembled from poured concrete. He was not a bad man, exactly. He was something more complicated than that, a man who had internalized a model of capability so completely that he could no longer see the edges of it. He looked at Teague for a long moment when the candidates lined up, not the way some men look at women in uniform, which is its own particular kind of insult. He looked at her the way a mechanic looks at a component he suspects is rated for the wrong application. Clinical. Already doubtful. Sergeant Teague, he said. Sir, you understand what this course entails. It was not a question. She treated it as one anyway. Long-range precision shooting, field craft, target analysis, and stress performance evaluation. 14 days. 5 candidates advance. He looked at her for another moment. It entails more than that. She waited. It entails finding out what you're made of when everything you rely on stops what's working. He paused. Some people find that out sooner than they expected. There was a ripple in the line. The man to Teague's left, Staff Sergeant Maddox Rangers, built like a shipping container, shifted slightly. Not much, just enough. The kind of shift that said he'd already decided something. Teague kept her eyes forward. The first 3 days were physical. Not gym physical, field physical, which is a different thing. They moved at night. They navigated without GPS, using terrain association and a compass and the kind of map reading that required patience and a willingness to stop and actually look at the ground. They carried weight. They slept in 2-hour increments, if they slept at all. One candidate dropped on the second day, a young staff sergeant from the 101st who twisted his ankle on a creek crossing and was out before he'd had a chance to show anything. Teague moved efficiently. She had learned early in her career that efficiency was the only currency that compounded over time. Speed cost energy she didn't have to waste. Strength was a variable. Economy of movement, economy of decision. These were constants, Maddox noticed. He didn't say anything directly, but she caught him watching her on the 3rd morning, when the remaining 11 candidates were reassembling after the navigation exercise that had taken most of the night. He had the look of a man revising a calculation he'd already submitted. She didn't give him anything. She filed that away. The shooting started on day 4. The range was set in a shallow valley between 2 ridges, and the morning light came in at a low angle that turned the target frames into bright rectangles floating above the brown grass. The candidates drew their assigned rifles, bolt-action precision systems in .308, iron-sighted and scope versions depending on the station, and began their preliminary work, zeroing, function checks, and worked through the fundamentals before anyone looked downrange at distance. Teague had shot this system before. She had, in fact, spent 14 months working with a team that used this platform for a specific application she still wasn't at liberty to describe in detail. She knew the trigger brake. She knew the way the cold bore shot ran, and she knew to account for it, and she knew that most people didn't. The first qualification string was at 300 yards. All 11 candidates passed, though 2 needed follow-up shots. The second string was at 500. 8 passed clean. 3 required refires. At 700 yards, 1 more candidate dropped off the qualification track. His shooting wasn't bad. His cold bore adjustment was. He'd been zeroed for a warmer barrel and hadn't corrected his data. Teague shot clean at every distance. She did not shoot quickly. She was deliberate in a way that looked almost slow from the outside, which was something that had always confused people who equated speed with competence. She built each shot from the position up, bone support first, muscle tension as the enemy, breathing as the framework, trigger press as the last event in a sequence that started well before her finger moved. Drayden was watching from the elevated position behind the firing line. She knew he was watching. She didn't adjust anything to perform for him. At the end of day 4, the scores were posted without names, just candidate numbers. Candidate 7 was first. That was Teague. Nobody announced it. Nobody made a point of it. But the candidates all looked at the sheet, and they could all count, and Maddox stood next to the board for an extra few seconds before he walked away. Day 6 was stalk. The stalk exercise was the one that eliminated more candidates than any other phase in courses like this, because it required a combination of things that didn't naturally coexist: patience, physical discomfort, and the ability to make decisions in real time without moving in a way that gave your position away. You moved through terrain toward an objective, in this case, a position from which you could engage a target, while 2 instructors with spotting scopes tried to find you. If they spotted you before you reached your position, you failed the lane. If your shot broke outside the designated parameters, you failed the lane. If your movement disturbed the vegetation in a way that flagged your approach, you failed the lane. The candidates were given 90 minutes. Teague had been crawling for 45 when she found the problem. The approach lane she'd selected, a low draw that ran parallel to the objective, had looked clean from the start position. But halfway through, the draw began to shallow out, and the grass changed, and she realized she was going to run out of concealment about 60 meters from her intended firing position. 60 meters of open ground with 2 instructors watching. She stopped moving. This was the first decision. There was a hedgerow to her right that she hadn't accounted for in her initial plan. It would cost her time to reach it and additional time to work along it, and she wasn't sure she had the minutes left to do both and still make the shot. She ran the numbers in her head the way she ran everything, not frantically, but systematically. She had maybe 35 minutes left. The hedgerow route added approximately 12 minutes of movement. She could still make it, but the margin was narrow enough that any additional problem would finish her. She went to the hedgerow. She moved along its base, using the root structure and the lower growth to stay as flat as the terrain would allow, which was not very flat. She was uncomfortable in a way that she had stopped trying to classify. Discomfort was information, not a verdict. It told her the ground was uneven. It told her there was a rock she hadn't cleared from under her right knee. It did not tell her to stop. She reached her position with 9 minutes remaining. The shot was at 430 meters. Wind from the left at approximately 6 miles per hour, which she estimated from the grass movement and confirmed against the mental index she maintained automatically. She settled into her position, established her natural point of aim, verified her position hadn't disturbed anything flagging her to the spotters. She waited 2 minutes, not because she needed to, because rushing was a failure mode she'd learned to eliminate before it had a chance to present itself. The shot broke clean. She heard the radio behind her, the instructor position, and one of them said quietly, "Good shot." They did not say her name. They didn't need to. That evening, in the space between the day's last brief and lights out, Maddox came and sat across from her at the table where she was reviewing her log. He didn't say anything immediately. He had the manner of a man who was assembling something carefully. "You're going to win this," he said finally. She looked at him. "Not a complaint," he added, "just an observation." "How many candidates left?" 7, she went back to her log. "Drayden's going to make it harder," Maddox said. She turned a page. "That's his job, I mean specifically." He paused. "I've heard things about how he runs the back half of this course. There are elements that aren't in the evaluation materials." She set down her pen. "Tell me what you heard," he told her. It took about 4 minutes. When he was done, she picked her pen back up. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. Because I came here thinking certain things, he said, and I was wrong about most of them. And I'm old enough now to at least know when that's happened. She considered that. Okay, she said. Okay, I heard you, thank you. She went back to her log. He sat there for another moment. Then he got up and left. What Maddox had described proved accurate. Day 8 introduced an element that wasn't in the official course materials, a psychological component that Drayden ran personally, which had no formal name but which the cadre referred to among themselves. Teague would learn this later as the grind. The grind was simple in design and difficult in execution. In the middle of the most demanding phase of the course, when the candidates were already sleep-deprived, physically depleted, and operating on compressed margins, Drayden began introducing information designed to undermine confidence. Not crude insults, nothing that obvious. Instead, quiet comments in the margins of evaluations. Some inconsistencies in your technique. Your data management showed gaps in the third evolution. Other candidates are demonstrating stronger fundamentals at this stage. None of it was specific, none of it was documented. And for most candidates, it worked. Not because they were weak, because they were tired, and when you are tired, the brain looks for explanations for the fatigue, and an authority figure pointing to flaws in your performance is an explanation that the exhausted brain is primed to accept. Teague heard Drayden's comments. She cataloged them the same way she cataloged wind data, as inputs to be assessed, not conclusions to be adopted. On day 9, he stopped her after the afternoon evolution. Your performance this week, he said, has been technically proficient. She waited. But technical proficiency isn't sufficient for this role. He looked at her with the same flat assessment from the first morning. This role requires something that can't be trained for. An instinct, a way of reading a situation that develops over years of specific experience. He paused. I'm not certain you have it yet. She looked at him. With respect, Colonel, I'd like to know specifically which evaluation metrics reflect a deficiency in situational assessment, and whether those observations have been documented in the official evaluation record. Something happened in his expression. Not anger, something more complicated. The look of a man who had expected a door to open inward and found it didn't move. That's a procedural question, he said. Yes, sir, it is. This course has elements that aren't captured in standard metrics. I understand that, sir. I'm asking whether the observation you just described is documented, and if so, where? He studied her for a long moment. It will be reflected in the composite assessment. I'd like to understand the weighting of that assessment before the course concludes, she said, and specifically which performances are feeding the composite. The silence lasted longer this time. I'll review that with you, he said finally. Thank you, sir. She walked back to the candidate billets. She did not look back. She already knew what the silence behind her meant. The final evolution was at distance. 800 meters. Wind variable, shifting between 6 and 12 miles per hour in 2-minute cycles. The candidates had been given no warm-up time. They drew their rifles from the armory at 0530 and were on the firing line as the sun came up behind them, which put the target in shadow and made reading the mirage in the scope more complicated than it would otherwise be. 5 candidates remained. 3 would advance. The math was simple. The firing order was determined by lot. Teague drew the 3rd position, which was neither advantageous nor disadvantageous, at a distance where the conditions changed significantly between shooters. She watched the first 2 candidates shoot while she built her environmental picture. The first candidate, a staff sergeant from the 82nd named Kellner, hit with his 2nd shot. The second, Maddox, hit with his first, which surprised nobody at this point in the course. Teague took her position. She established her data. The wind call required watching the mirage and cross-referencing against the grass movement at the intermediate distances, because at 800 meters, the wind that touched the grass at the muzzle and the wind that touched the bullet at 400 meters were not the same wind. She had learned this at a time and place she didn't name in polite conversation. She waited for a lull, not a full stop. The wind hadn't fully stopped once in the last 20 minutes, but a moment where the cycle shifted, where the mirage lay over slightly, where the numbers aligned. She pressed the shot. The target fell. There was the silence that follows a good shot, the particular silence of people who know what they just saw. And then from the position behind her, one of the junior cadre said something to the instructor next to him that she wasn't meant to hear but heard anyway. That's the best shot of the week. Drayden released the scores 3 hours later. Teague was first, Maddox was second, Kellner was third. The other two candidates were notified that they had not advanced. There was no ceremony. Drayden read the selections from a printed sheet. His voice was flat and even. When he read Teague's name, he moved directly to the next without the half-beat of acknowledgement he gave the others. She noticed. She said nothing. Afterward, in the brief that followed the selections, Drayden addressed the three who had advanced. "This role," he said, "is one of the most demanding in the force. You've been selected because your performance indicated you can meet that standard." He paused. "All three of you." She felt Maddox glance at her from 3 feet away. She kept her eyes on Drayden. "There are aspects of this course," Drayden continued, "that exist outside the standard evaluation rubric. Some candidates find those aspects more challenging than the technical elements." He paused again, longer this time. "I want to be clear that those elements are designed to identify something specific. Resilience under a particular kind of pressure." He was looking at the middle distance, not at her. She understood what he was doing. He was offering a framework, an explanation that closed the door on what she'd asked him 4 days ago. The grind wasn't bias in his construction. It was methodology. It was professional. It was for the candidate's own benefit. She had heard this construction before, in different rooms, with different words, from different men who believed it completely. That was the thing that made it so durable. He wasn't lying. He genuinely believed that what he'd done was a form of protection, that the candidates who broke under psychological pressure deserved to be broken, because the alternative, letting them advance to a role where they would face worse, was the true cruelty. The logic was coherent. It was also the kind of logic that required you never to ask who defined the pressure, who documented the breaks, and who decided, without accountability, which candidates the grind was meant to find. She didn't say any of this in the brief. She thanked Drayden for the instruction. She shook hands with Maddox and Kellner. She picked up her gear. On her way out of the building, she stopped at the desk of the course administrator, a young warrant officer named Eschler, who looked like he'd been running on 4 hours of sleep for 2 weeks, which he probably had. "I'd like to request a copy of the official evaluation record for the course," she said. "My own file." Eschler looked at her. "You can submit a request through the S1. I'll do that. I wanted to note the request formally." She paused. "Can you document that I came by in person?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he wrote something in the log on his desk, dated it, initialed it. "Done," he said. "Thank you." She walked out into the afternoon. The trees had moved further along while she'd been inside, more bare now, less color left. The sky was the kind of pale blue that doesn't commit to anything. She stood outside the building for a moment, not moving, just letting the cold air settle around her. Maddox was leaning in a vehicle 20 feet away. He had the look of a man who had watched what just happened and was filing it carefully. "That was deliberate," he said. "The log, yes, most people wouldn't have done that." She picked up her bag. "Most people assume the documentation exists already." He was quiet for a moment. "Does it?" She thought about Drayden's face when she'd asked him about the composite assessment, the way the calculation behind his eyes had shifted. "I don't know yet," she said. "That's the point." She started toward the parking lot. "Teague," Maddox said behind her. She stopped. What happens now? She thought about the 3 billets that had no official name. The role she'd spent the last 14 days earning the right to fill. The warrant officer's log entry, dated and initialed, that now existed in an official record whether anyone intended it to or not. "Now we do the job," she said. She kept walking. The cold air moved through the bare branches above her and made no sound at all.